politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. You know, so often here on Point of View, we talk about very important issues, but oftentimes they're quite polarizing. We don't intend them to be so, but in a culture that has turned its back on biblical ideas, sometimes we find ourselves kind of caught in the middle between various kinds of groups that are really trying to articulate different views, and sometimes doing those in ways that certainly are not Christ-like. Not that you expect sinners to act like Christians, but nevertheless something to think about in that regard. But we're going to spend some time in this first hour today talking about how we can articulate in a loving but firm way our biblical convictions, and at the same time maybe color outside the lines, because that is the title of this book, Jesus Outside the Lines, A Way Forward for Those Who Are Tired of Taking Sides. Lots of great endorsements of this book by individuals who have been on this program, like Tim Keller and Stephen Curtis Chaplin and Tullian Tervision and many, many others. It is written by Scott Sauls, who is the senior pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Before that, he actually was the preaching pastor for Redeemer Presbyterian Church and working alongside Tim Keller. This is his first book, and the first question I have to ask is why, because he is such a great writer, and we bring him now to the microphone by phone. So, Scott, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kirby. Really appreciate it.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the reason for this, and you start off with, I think, a very good comment, and that is the idea that you decided to write the book because you were tired of taking sides, that is, tired of the gossip, the negative stereotypes, the labeling, the accusations. Anybody that does not know what you're talking about just needs to turn on maybe cable television tonight, or any kind of, maybe watch something on television, listen to a lot of typical talk shows, maybe even see Letters to the Editor, and you get a pretty good idea of what you're actually very concerned about.
Yes, I think that the timing of the book was interesting. I didn't anticipate this, but at the beginning of 2015, a whole slew of articles started to come out. The first one was in Slate magazine, where it identified 2014 as the year of outrage, and it had 14, 15 different essays about outrage in the culture. And then Emma Green in The Atlantic wrote a piece called Taming Christian Outrage, where she talks about how sometimes Christians will shoot ourselves in the foot by entering into sort of this outrage environment, looking for something to be offended by, and then pouncing on it on social media and the blogs, sermons and so on. And so what the book is just an attempt to advocate for maybe a more persuasive way of, for Christians in particular, to engage with the culture where it seems like it's normative to get angry about something and take sides against someone. And I guess I'm trying to advocate for a different way than that, and maybe a more persuasive way in the book.
Well, and I think another one I could add to that would be Sam Harris, who's one of the so-called new atheists, who wrote a book called Letter to a Christian Nation, in which he just talked about the way he was treated, and if indeed Christians are supposed to be loving individuals, he didn't see very much of that in his reaction. And as somebody that spent a fair amount of time speaking on college campuses, I can tell you that things can heat up pretty quickly just if you identify yourself as a Christian. We certainly recognize that, but at the same time, we can certainly, I hope, learn to disagree without being disagreeable, and that certainly seems to be the thrust of your book.
Yeah, I think if you're to boil down the thesis of the whole book, it's basically that the more conservative we are in our beliefs about Jesus as he's presented in the Bible, the more conservative we are about our beliefs in him, the more liberal we will be in our loving. In other words, we will become more difficult to offend. We will become much more winsome, much more engaging, much more loving. We'll have integrity in our convictions. We'll hold to our convictions about biblical truth, but not in spite of our convictions about biblical truth, but because of our convictions that Jesus is full of grace and truth. We will also, because of those convictions, genuinely learn to love, listen to, and serve people who don't share our convictions, and to be able to do both of those at the same time, to have convictions and also love, listen to, and serve those who don't share our convictions.
What I thought was so interesting is early on in the book you have a story of actually an article and a little quote from Chris Stedman, and he's talking about the divide between Christians and atheists and talking about building bridges and so really trying not to have barriers but building bridges, and yet it's the Harvard chaplain who's an atheist. And so I love the way you put it. If an atheist believes that is possible, as a Christian even more so, we should not only believe that that's possible, but really essential to the Christian faith.
Yes, I think Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler is really exemplary along those lines, where you had a person in this rich young ruler who did not buy in to what Jesus was calling him to, as Jesus called him to himself. Get rid of everything you have, come follow me, and you'll experience life. And the rich ruler, because his money had him around the neck, he went the other direction. He started to walk away from Christ, and interestingly, the observation that the gospel writer makes is that as the rich ruler, while he was in the act of walking away from Christ, essentially an act of atheism, right? An act of intentional unbelief in Christ. He's walking away. It says that Jesus looked at him while he walked away and loved him.
Yes.
When Judas betrays Jesus, very overtly, very explicitly, to love not just our friends, not just those who agree with us, but to love our enemies. I mean, Jesus was pretty explicit about that, to pray even for those and bless even those who persecute us, if there's a way to do that. He calls us into that.
Scott Sauls with us as we are talking about his book, Jesus Outside the Lines, A Way Forward to Those Who Are Tired of Taking Sides. I might mention that it is published by Tyndale House. You can certainly look for it in your local bookstore, but we have some links for you that would be helpful. First of all, if you click on a picture of the book, you could get a copy of it there, but of course look for it in your bookstore. But if you don't have a bookstore nearby or would certainly like to get that book early, we've made that possible. We have a link to Scott Sauls' website at scottsauls.com, and that is a way you can follow him. Might also encourage you, I've found a number of his videos on YouTube, and you can kind of follow along, especially as we get into one of the conversations we're going to have today, and that is the whole issue of human sexuality and same-sex marriage and those kinds of issues. But we're going to be talking about much more than that. Certainly when we come back from the break, I want to get into some of the generational changes. We've talked about reaching out to the millennial generation, but he talks about in his chapter a generational shift and what that means. And then we're going to talk about the unborn and the poor. We're going to talk a little bit about how to address the issue of money. My commentary recently on the so-called 1% are some topics that we'll get into. So stay tuned. A little bit later, of course, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation. The topic today, Jesus Outside the Lines. Scott Sauls with us. We'll be back with more right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
The American family is in decline, but sometimes it's hard to see how far we've come because the changes are often subtle and incremental. Each generation comes into the world already taking as a baseline changes that occurred before they arrived. Perhaps the best way to document the decline of the family is to compare where we are today to where we were in 1960. Back then, more than 9 out of 10 U.S. households with children had both a father and a mother who were married. Married parents of children wasn't the majority, it was the overwhelming norm. Today, married couples can only be found in about 2/3 of U.S. households with kids. During the decades from 1960 to now, we have discovered through various research studies that children need both a father and a mother. Dr. Patrick Fagan, working first at the Heritage Foundation and now at the Family Research Council, has put together a massive database of studies done by hundreds of researchers on marriage. They conclude what the Bible has taught for millennia. Children need a father and a mother. Out-of-wedlock births is one of the reasons children are growing up without two parents. In a column on the Great Society programs, Pat Buchanan gives these sobering statistics. Half of all children born to women under 30 in America now are illegitimate. 3 in 10 white children are born out of wedlock, as are 53% of Hispanic babies and 73% of black babies. Divorce is another reason for family decline, and as I've discussed in previous commentaries, cohabitation increases the likelihood of future divorce. Here again, we can see a remarkable change in attitudes. Charles Murray, in his book, The State of White America, reminds us of a survey of women in the 1960s. It asked, in your opinion, do you think that it is right for a woman to have sexual relations before marriage with a man she knows she's going to marry? 86% of the women said no. It is easy to see that the American family is in decline. All we have to do is look back a few decades. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Topic today, Jesus Outside the Lines, a way forward for those who are tired of taking sides. Tim Keller says Jesus Outside the Lines is a refreshing look at discipleship in our late modern times. While it's impossible to cover all the possible topics, Scott's book is still surprisingly comprehensive and readable at the same time. He seamlessly weaves together theology, cultural critique, Christian ethics, and character formation in each chapter. The result is a picture of Christian living that should be attractive to believers and to many skeptics as well. You know, Scott, your book gets into the divide between red state or blue state. And, of course, there are a lot of people choosing up sides. We understand that. But a theme in that section is something we've been talking about here on Point of View for some time, and that is, how do you reach the millennial generation? There seems to be a generational shift, and you talk about that in that chapter.
In the chapter on politics, you mean?
Yes, on red state and blue state.
Yes, I think that it's becoming fairly clear on those who sort of track trends generationally that from a political perspective, whereas maybe the Boomer generation was, particularly within evangelical Christianity, predominantly red state in their sensibilities. The millennial generation seems to be experiencing a shift, particularly within evangelicalism, toward more blue state sensibilities with active concern for engagement with the poor and justice and things of that sort. And so you see basically a generation of parents and grandparents who are seeing their believing grandchildren and children sort of moving into a different direction politically. And what I'm trying to say in the book is that's actually okay. That actually is to be expected within the kingdom of God, a diversity of political perspectives, because every political position has something good and true and beautiful about it, and every political position and platform also has things that are broken about them. And I'm sure that most of your listeners can point out the good on their own side and the broken on the other side, wherever they're coming from. But the telling thing about the scriptures is that within Jesus' group of chosen disciples, you've got Simon, who's an anti-government zealot, and you've got Matthew, who's not only a government employee, but the worst kind of government employee to people in those days, a tax collector. And Jesus doesn't call them to sort of tribalize and separate from one another. He calls them to be one, and he prays for them to be one, and he insists that they see his kingdom as the higher kingdom, because his kingdom isn't of this world. And interestingly, among the four gospel writers, Matthew is the one that highlights the fact that Simon is a zealot and that Matthew is a tax collector, which was pretty telling.
And I think it illustrates, again, just the kind of world that we're going to be in, where people come from different sectors of society. But also, I thought what was one theme that runs through your book is the fact that if we're going to be true to the gospel and true to biblical preaching and teaching, we're going to have to expect to be misunderstood. And early on, you tell the story of giving a sermon on poverty to a crowd of New Yorkers. And you get the same kind of emails I get, because one email said that you were a right-wing extremist. A second email said that it was sure that you were a left-wing Marxist. So you get from all sides. And I kind of think it brings us into chapter 2, where we are living in this world right now where some people say you have to choose in terms of human dignity, whether it's the unborn or the poor. But you put those two together, and I think that's really the biblical idea, that we should be concerned about individuals from the moment of conception to death, despite their frailties, despite their economic circumstances. If we are going to be true to this idea of the sanctity of human life, we should address all of those issues from birth to death.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that a great example of that was C. Everett Koop, who was a Surgeon General who famously co-wrote a book with Francis Schaeffer called "Whatever Happened to the Human Race," and it was a book that was advocating for a pro-life position from a place of Christian conviction in defense and protection of the unborn inside the womb. And yet later on in his administration, also because of his Christian convictions, the AIDS crisis began to be a big issue in Western culture. And back at that time, AIDS was thought to only affect gay men. And C. Everett Koop, not in spite of his Christian convictions, but because of his Christian convictions, poured the weight of his office and his influence and the resources into research to find a cure for AIDS, because he saw his sort of responsibility to be a pro-life person, to be in favor of the protection and the dignity of every life, whether they believed as he did or not, whether they shared his morality or not. That the pro-life position, to be truly pro-life and to be truly consistent, like you said just a moment ago, Kirby, it has to be from conception all the way to death. Otherwise, we're somehow maybe being inconsistent in whatever our pro-poor or pro-child in the womb stance might be. We've got to look at everybody in the equation.
What about dealing with, say, individuals that need some kind of help? You tell the story that one day while living in New York City, you were walking down Broadway, minding your own business, when a woman outside a bagel shop asked if I would buy her something to eat. I thought, there's a good example. We can talk about this in a theoretical way, but how do we help those who are poor, downtrodden? How do we help those who have needs? How do we sort through those who have wants and needs? Those are really difficult questions if we're really going to be compassionate Christians, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, if I'm going to give you a soundbite answer, which I really need to do to just respect the fact that you probably have a lot of things you want to talk about, I think the best thing that Christians can do, particularly Christians who don't have a lot of direct encounters with the poor, is I'm going to promote another book here. I know I'm here to sort of promote Jesus outside the lines, but I would encourage any Christian who wants to care for the poor well to get their hands on Brian Fickert and Steve Corbett's book called "When Helping Hurts." Mm-hmm. And just a terrific philosophy, might even be great interview to have on your program. Very, very wise in terms of engagement with the poor. But basically, what we would advocate for is to find organizations in your city, in the town or municipality where you live, that's engaging the poor along the lines of the principle of that book, and partner with them and get behind what they're doing. Because it's a lot easier to get behind people who already are on the ground, they know what they're doing, than it is to reinvent the wheel from a place of not really knowing fully what the poor need. And so that's that's my sound bite without getting into too many specifics or details.
Again, the book is entitled When Helping Hurts, How to Alleviate Poverty Without Hurting the Poor and Yourself. And of course, we're talking about this book with Scott Sauls, Jesus Outside the Lines. I thought we might even get into this issue of money and poverty as well. My commentary yesterday, it's too bad I didn't have it running today, was on the idea of the 1%, because we all hear a lot of people say we're the 99%. But if you compare us to the world, anybody that makes $32,000 or more a year is in that 1%. And so I find it interesting that sometimes we have this division between the 1% and the 99% here in America. But if you were to instead expand your vision beyond what that might be to the world, virtually all of our listeners, or most of our listeners, would be in the 1% compared to the rest of the world. And that, I think, from our Christian point of view, calls us to be involved in reaching those who are less fortunate, whether it can be going on short-term mission trips or becoming a missionary, whether it's World Vision, Compassion International. It's something that we need to do, recognizing the tremendous blessing that those of us have in this country because of the economic prosperity that's here.
That is absolutely correct, and I think that, just for perspective, like you were saying, you could take many people who are actually living below the poverty level by American standards, and many of those who are living below poverty level in America are actually in the wealthiest 50% of the world. Given the stunning reality that over half of the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day. And so, yes, absolutely, our calling as Christians is global. It's local, it's national, but it's certainly global and beyond the United States and beyond the places where we live. And again, I think just linking arms with organizations that are doing great work on the ground. You already mentioned World Vision and Compassion International, which are wonderful. They're also, Stephen Curtis and Mary Beth Chapman are part of our church here, and they have founded this organization called Show Hope, which is a global adoption agency focusing primarily on children from China, who are in very desperate positions, and they put children in families and help to resource that. I mean, there are all kinds of organizations that are doing great work on the ground, and absolutely couldn't agree with you more that the Western church, which is largely the affluent church, needs to get on board with those efforts.
Need to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about Jesus Outside the Lines. Scott Sauls with us. Visit our website for more information. We'll be right back.
Have you ever had this happen? You've been praying a long time for someone, and unexpectedly, someone comes up and says, "Hey, you know that person? I've been praying for them too." How does that make you feel? Encouraged? Motivated? Inspired? All of that and more? Praying is beyond value, but when you tell someone, it multiplies the joy. A while ago, Point of View began its Pray for America campaign, offering a free booklet, a wrist reminder, prayer updates. And you know what I think? I think many have prayed for the things we've asked them to pray for, but for whatever reason, you haven't officially joined the campaign. If that's you, I'm asking you to encourage Kirby and the team today and sign up before the National Day of Prayer this Thursday. pointofview.net/pray. Be an encouragement. Join us in prayer. Sign up for the Pray for America campaign. pointofview.net/pray. pointofview.net/pray. And make sure you join others Thursday and pray for America. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212. You may just want to sit back and listen to some of the wisdom today from Scott Sauls, but if you'd like to join our conversation, feel free to give us a call. We'll get to those calls a little bit later if we have some time, but did want you to have a little bit of an understanding of this new book, Jesus Outside the Lines. It is published by Tyndale. You can certainly look for it in your local bookstore, but if not, we certainly have a link to it as well. First part of the book talks about Jesus outside the lines of my Christian tribe. And there's much more we could cover there, but since it's a 200-page book, I wanted to cover the second part of it as well, Jesus outside the lines of Christianity. And there, Scott, you talk about affirmation or critique, accountability or compassion, hypocrite or work in progress, so many different issues. But let's talk about affirmation for just a minute, because you talk about the fact that affirmation is something that we don't have caveats for. We certainly should recognize that there are times when we need to provide a biblical critique. But again, I guess it gets back to this concept of speaking truth in love and to know how to engage the various debates that we have around us in a way that still affirm the person, even if we might disagree with their behavior or their particular position. How can we go about doing that?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. You know, I've been a Christian for, I don't know, almost 30 years and a minister for, 18 or so, and I've yet still to meet a single person who has the testimony that they became a Christian, that they fell in love with Jesus, they crossed over from death to life because of a Christian who scolded them about their ethics. I think if you look at or about their morality, I think if you look at Jesus, look at his interaction, for instance, with the woman caught in adultery. Everybody in the religious community wants to condemn her, public shaming, all the rest. I've always wondered why they didn't drag the man who was also caught in adultery out in public, but that's another story. But they're all wanting to shame her and scold her about her ethics, about her sexual ethics, interestingly, and Jesus is left alone with her at the end of that engagement and asks her, and basically tells her, I don't condemn you, now leave your life of sin. Now, he doesn't leave either one of those statements out. I don't condemn you, there's the grace. Now leave your life of sin, there's the ethics and the morality and the life of obedience to God as an expression of your love for God because of the love he's given to you. But, I don't condemn you, now leave your life of sin, really, I think, and I'm suggesting in the book, is the pattern that we Christians really need to be going out into the world of engagement. I don't condemn you, now let's talk about ethics. We have to establish the environment of grace, establish the environment of love and kindness before we start, pouncing on conversations about ethics and morality. I mean, you've got this here in Acts chapter 17 as well, when Paul walks into Athens, very secular environment, very idolatrous, and the first thing that he says to them is, men of Athens, I see that you're very religious. He takes even the worst thing about them, their idolatry, and finds something good behind it, to affirm that at least you're seeking for truth, at least you're seeking for life's ultimate meaning. You're religious, and so let's start there, and then he quotes their own secular poets and philosophers from memory, and shows them that he's with them, that he's for them, and then he starts getting into conversations about truth. But you reverse the order of those sentences. I don't condemn you, now leave your life of sin. You lose Christianity and you lose Jesus, because it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance. It's not repentance that leads to the kindness of God.
Well said. In the New Testament, you used Acts 17. Here you have a culture that's a lot like our culture today, multicultural, pluralistic, somewhat skeptical, and the rest. You go in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, I think tells us a little bit and gives us some guidance on how to relate to secular people, maybe even in authority over us. It seems to me we can learn a lot more from that, and we need to make a shift, Scott, because there was a time, I'm, I guess, the oldest one around the table here, there was a time not so long ago where, especially in, say, where you live now in the Nashville Tennessee area, where you could go outside of church and even talk to people that didn't even proclaim Christ, didn't even believe in the Bible, but nevertheless would give you sort of biblical answers. Now you can even go inside a lot of churches and not get biblical answers from individuals. So it seems to me that there has been that shift, and I think we can learn a lot more from the Apostle Paul and how he related to a pagan, secular culture. We can learn a lot more from Daniel, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they related to a foreign culture, because, quite frankly, our culture is becoming a lot more foreign to Christianity, isn't it?
Yes. Very, very rapidly. Interesting. You mentioned Nashville. Has long been known as the buckle of the Bible Belt, but now it's becoming more. It's growing more and more into its other name, which is interestingly the Athens of the South. It's becoming more pluralistic, more secular, and I think that is actually an opportunity for Christianity to sort of regroup and to think again about what it means for Christianity to thrive, because Christianity has always thrived and advanced the most, not as a powerful majority, but as a life-giving counterculture minority in the culture. And the way that it is counterculture is that it surprises the culture with not only the truth, but also with love and with deeds of mercy and justice, and taking better care of, to quote Emperor Julian from ancient Rome, the Christians, the reason why Christianity grew so much in Rome, even when Rome was hostile to Christianity, was because the Christians took better care of the poor in Rome than Rome did. Christianity took better care of its enemies than their enemies took care of each other. And so I think being a minority in Western culture is actually an opportunity for the church to return to being what the church was in the New Testament.
Well said. You have a chapter on hypocrite or work in progress. I know that occasionally when you make your way through the Gospel of Matthew, I've preached sermons on hypocrites. And, of course, Jesus has quite a bit to say about that in Matthew 6, to put it mildly. But I always start by saying, everyone in this room is a hypocrite, which kind of takes their wind away. I said, no, let's be honest, not every day, but all of us at some time or another have been hypocrites. So let's recognize there's brokenness here. I don't think there's anybody here that doesn't have some brokenness in their life. There's probably not anyone here that hasn't been a hypocrite at some time in their life. But what you're struggling with, and I think many Christians, and even the Barna reports and others are struggling with, is that Christians don't live any differently. And you quote Mahatma Gandhi, who says, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." We obviously sometimes fall short, but I think it's also a call for us to live the godly life before the watching world. And Francis Schaeffer's talking about that, and George Barna's talked about it. And it just seems to me that that's something that is really needed here in the 21st century, don't you think?
I do think that, and I also think that Gandhi himself was being a little bit inconsistent, because it doesn't make sense that if you have an affection for Jesus, to decide not to follow Jesus because of his followers and not on the merits of who Christ is. But at the same time, I think, yes, your statement to your room full of friends that we all carry hypocrisy, we all live inconsistently with who we say we are. Steve Brown says that if preachers were only allowed to preach on the things that they lived out perfectly and faithfully all the time, there would be nothing for anybody to preach about except for Jesus. And so the question that I'm trying to pose in that particular chapter of the book is not, will we be hypocrites, or are we hypocrites? Yes, we are. And part of being authentic is recognizing and admitting how inauthentic we can be sometimes. The question is not, will we be hypocrites? The question is, what kind? Are we going to be the smug, defensive, holier-than-thou kind of hypocrite, which everybody can see through that? Or are we going to be the endearing kind of hypocrite that does admit, yes, I'm not what I should be. I own that. I'm sorry for that. Always the first people to apologize, Christians should be. Always the first people to admit that we haven't fulfilled our promises completely. Christians should always be the first to admit those things. I mean, if the Apostle Paul writes openly about his own struggle with coveting in Romans 7, or at the very end of his ministry refers to himself as the chief sinner, then we should have a sense of freedom. If we really believe that we're loved by Christ, if we really believe that there's nothing in all creation that can separate us from the love of the one whose love matters more than any other love, then shouldn't we be a little bit more free, or maybe even a lot more free, to own up to what we say we believe, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we all need grace every day.
Need to take a break. When we come back, we'll focus on one of the more controversial chapters, because it's one of the more controversial issues in this society right now, and that's the issue of sexual freedom and how we relate to individuals that want to redefine marriage, who have same-sex attractions, that believe that living and having various relations outside of God-ordained marriage is permissible. Certainly, that is a very tough question, and it is really one of the big questions of the day. So we'll talk about that with Scott Sauls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Scott Sauls with us as we talk about his book, Jesus Outside the Lines. And Scott, just a minute ago, had somebody want to ask, how do you apply this to same-sex marriage? And that's why I waited till now to get into that. And I might just also mention that not only is Chapter 8 a very good kind of guideline for how to deal with that, I know at your church, and I've watched some of the videos, you've had a forum on same-sex attraction, and Stephen Moore and you and others have addressed this, and really started asking the question, how do we welcome those who don't share our vision for sexuality? So What would you suggest? Because this has kind of become the preeminent issue of our day, and I know not only do people in the pews, but even pastors wonder, how exactly do I manage this? Truth and grace, how does it all fit together? Do you have some thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts, and actually, they're out there on the blogosphere. If I may, I've got a piece on the Gospel Coalition website called "Toward a Graciously Historic Sexual Ethic." I wrote for QIdeas.org on, can Christianity and the LGBTQ community be friends? Can we get along? So there's a lot out there, and also my own blog, scottsauls.com. I've put a couple of pieces up recently, but basically, I think that the starting point is to again go back to Christ Himself and ask the question: how did Jesus engage people whose sexual ethic was not consistent with the historic Orthodox Christian sex ethic? And what I find when I look at His engagement with the prostitute in Luke 7, with the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, with the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, Mary Magdalene, who's chosen to be the first eyewitness of His resurrection, we never find Jesus, scolding, coming down hard on, pouncing on somebody with a broken sexual history or even current broken sexual practices. He always seemed to move toward them very, very gently. And like we talked about a minute ago, and the woman caught in adultery, He did address her morality. He did encourage her toward and really command her toward a life of purity and chastity from that point forward of the recognition that He loved her and didn't condemn her. But the only ones who ever did the scolding of people with a broken sexuality were the people that Jesus turned around and scolded them for scolding the broken person. And so I think that it's got to be just very, very clear from the get-go that this is a fragile area of sin and brokenness that Jesus consistently treated with the utmost of gentleness. Now the exception to that, and Paul writes about this very strongly to the Corinthians, is inside the church. If somebody is being unfaithful to their spouse and sexually irresponsible within the church, then that person needs to be pursued very directly and very openly. But when Paul talks about people who are living in sexual immorality outside of the church, Paul advocates for friendship. Paul advocates for moving into those people's lives and providing a presence of the love of Christ in their lives over the course of time in the context of friendship. But again, we get ourselves in trouble if we start the conversation with, leave your life of sin, and then you might not be condemned, when the conversation really needs to start, just as Jesus did with a sexually broken adulteress: I do not condemn you. And we'll get to our ethics and morality conversation after we establish that clearly, as Jesus clearly did with her.
I might just mention, too, that your website, which we do have a link to, scottsauls.com, I was looking through before the program and just, again, looking through it again, all the various blog entries, which would be helpful to our listeners. And, Scott, for just a minute, we do have a lot of pastors as well as church leaders who listen to this program. And so they may be head up a small group study. They may be a Bible study fellowship leader. They may be a Sunday school leader. They may be on a church staff. It seems to me that this book especially would be helpful. Every listener should read this book and can read this book. But for just a minute, since you are a pastor and you've worked with Tim Keller, what would you say to people in positions of leadership, the pastors and teachers? Because a lot of what is communicated needs to be communicated from the pulpit, don't you think?
Well, it certainly communicated from my pulpit. I'm certainly not the judge of what needs to be communicated from other people's pulpits. But I do hope that the book is a helpful resource to pastors and ministry leaders and those who have a position of influence. Parents talking to their children about issues like sexuality and politics and money and things like that. It is designed to be a resource along those lines, that enables Christians to hold firmly to our convictions about biblical truth, while, because of those convictions, being full of grace and truth. And so there actually is a resource available, free download on my website, scottsauls.com/JOTL. That's short for Jesus Outside the Lines. scottsauls.com/JOTL. There's a free group discussion resource that has discussion questions available for every chapter in the book. 6 questions for each chapter in the book right there. You can also download the first chapter on politics for free if you want to get a look at it before you decide whether or not you want the book. But yeah, it's ideally for group studies, not just for Christians and Christians, but for Christians and also their friends who aren't necessarily convinced about Christianity, but who are interested in and open to having these discussions.
Well, glad you mentioned that, because I was going to go there next. Again, scottsauls.com/JOTL, which stands for Jesus Outside the Lines. There are the endorsements. There's a sample chapter, which you might want to get, but also a book summary, and most importantly, the free resources. It seems to me that would be very good for either a personal study, or I think if individuals are looking for the next study they might want to do for a Bible study, this would be a book I would recommend. So, Scott, I appreciate the good work that you have been doing. Of course, I'm very familiar with Christ Presbyterian Church, and I certainly appreciate this book. And it's your first book. You need to write more. So let's see if we can do that again sometime. And thank you for being on the program.
Just wrote chapter 1 for book number 2 this morning, so good timing for that comment. You've done great research. Thank you for reading the book.
Well, thank you for writing it. We'll maybe talk again, but just before we go, let's, if we can, just mention some of the resources we've been talking about here today, and those resources are at our website, pointofview.net. We have links to Scott Sauls and his website, and again, one of the issues we talked about here is this whole issue of sexual freedom. If you want to understand how this whole area of homosexuality has become a game changer, just think about this. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed in 1993. It was introduced by Ted Kennedy into the Senate, and it was introduced in the House by, at that time, Representative Schumer. Now, of course, he is Senator Schumer. It was signed by Bill Clinton, and it wasn't even controversial. Then when a variation of that was introduced into Indiana, we all are aware of the firestorm that broke out, the decision by the governor, Mike Pence, to back down. And we see now, as some people are writing, that Indiana is perhaps the most hostile state to religious freedom, according to some of these new articles that are coming out, because of all the amendments and because of the way the gay rights movement changed it. And all of that within less than a generation. It illustrates why we are certainly going to have to think biblically about these issues. If you want to do so, that's one of the things we encourage you to do, and that is to read some of the books that we talk about, to find some of the articles, and they're available on our website, pointofview.net. You can get my daily viewpoints there. Of course, we have various videos and take action elements, and so we encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, I hope that you'll also consider what you might do to help us continue bringing these programs to you, because we are convinced that we are in a different world. It's going to be important for us to know how to think and to act biblically in every area of life. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Thanks to your brothers and sisters in Australia, people around the world are specifically praying for you right now. Did you know that? Lana Vosser said, "There is a fight for the destiny of the USA right now. The Lord is calling His people to arise and pray for the United States of America." Matt Prater, "We are calling the nations of the world to join in prayer and fasting with our brothers and sisters in Christ in the USA. We are believing for over 100 nations to join us in prayer and fasting for the U.S. And all of that is happening right now, today. Isn't that humbling and encouraging? The nations are praying for us. Thursday is our own National Day of Prayer, and we urge you to encourage us at Point of View by signing up for our Pray for America campaign. We will send you a free Pray for America booklet, a wrist reminder, and occasional email updates on important things to pray for. Step up, join today, pointofview.net/pray. Pointofview.net/pray. www.livecast.org/pray. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to talk about ISIS, and that is certainly relevant in light of the terrorist act just actually not even 15 miles down the road from where we're broadcasting right now. Certainly relevant in light of some of the conversation we've had in the past with Tom Doyle about killing Christians and whether or not a Christian Holocaust has begun. This new book entitled Defying ISIS, Preserving Christianity in the Place of Its Birth and in Your Own Backyard. Johnnie Moore is the author of that book. He's been with us in the past when he at that time served as the senior vice president at Liberty University. Last time we had him on, we found out that he's now a Hollywood executive working with Mark Burnett and others, and is certainly one of the more influential young leaders in the world, has an ability to really address the millennial generation, and has been on all sorts of programs, including even last night, and we're privileged to have him on our program today. Johnny, always great to have you on Point of View with us.
It's great to be back.
I'd love to know a little bit about the genesis of this book, because we're going to tell some of the stories, but in some respects you are vying for what I call the Eric Metaxas Award for the most eclectic resume. Somebody that's been at Liberty, now in Hollywood, writing on all sorts of things from discerning God's will to defying ISIS. You certainly have been able to address so many different issues, but I'd love to know a little bit more about how you have been able to pull some of this together for this book.
Well, I tell you, it's a personal passion of mine that has taken various incarnations through my life and career and my ministry. And I'd say I've been involved, just as an individual in issues related to the persecuted church for more than a decade.
Sure.
But back then, all of this stuff was very, very underground. You sort of smuggled stories, or others did, out of these countries where Christians were being persecuted. But now we're seeing something totally, totally different. We're seeing persecution like we've rarely seen since the first century, when Rome, on public display, martyred Christians. And I think all of us have been shocked by both the scale and the brutality of the situation with ISIS. But as I started getting burdened about this, I started educating myself more, and I attended meetings all over the world. And one meeting, in fact, that was 1 year before ISIS took over Mosul. And while almost no one in the world expected a terrorist group to take over the second largest city in Iraq, I was sitting in the room with Christian leaders from all over that part of the world, and they all were predicting exactly what we saw 1 year later. And they were screaming, but it seemed like no one was paying attention.
We might also mention that you have witnessed some of the things happening there in the Middle East with the refugee crisis and things of that nature. Also, the result of that was the Cradle Fund, which is a nonprofit organization focused on providing immediate humanitarian assistance for the rescue, restoration, and return of displaced Christians to practice their faith free from fear. So we do want to talk about some of the ways in which you can get involved. And as always, we have some links. One of those, of course, is to Johnnie Moore's website, but it'll take you to defyingisis.com. And, of course, that is the title of this new book, published by W. And your real goal there is to kind of tell some of those stories, because if nothing else, we see some of those videos that ISIS puts out, but we need to know the story behind some of those, and you've done a very good job of collecting some of those.
Yeah, well, when I went to Iraq, I heard the same thing over and over and over from these displaced Christian pastors and just regular people. And they all told me, literally, all of them, the same thing. They said, we feel forgotten. We're living in this world with 2 billion Christians, and it's not only that it seems like nobody cares for us, it's even more hurtful that our Christian brothers and sisters don't care for us. And I explained to them, that I actually think, sadly and embarrassingly, that most Christians in the United States of America and the West haven't a clue there are even Christians in places like Iraq and Syria, much less Christians that have had thriving communities since the apostles. The tradition in the Iraqi church is that the apostle Thomas brought the gospel to Iraq. I mean, they're Christian communities that thrived in Iraq and Syria for thousands of years until this year, until the 21st century, when this terrorist group was allowed to destroy them. And so, I just decided if no one was going to tell their stories, I would do it. If people weren't educated, I would educate them. And I wanted, by the way, to do it accurately. And so I went myself, and I hired a research team to go into the refugee camps and get video documentation of the stories that are cited in the book, so that I could tell the real story of what's happening. And I promised those Christians when I was with them in Iraq and Jordan and other places that I would raise my voice for them. And that's just what I'm trying to do. And I entitled the book Defying ISIS because I was so inspired by their faith. These Christians nearly lost their lives for their faith alone. And yet when you go to the refugee camps in places like Iraq and Jordan, you can immediately tell where the Christians are because they affix crosses to the tops of their tents. They're not ashamed of Jesus Christ. In fact, they're more bold about Jesus Christ than they've ever been before.
It's just amazing. Newt Gingrich, a former Speaker of the House, said that Johnnie Moore is courageously focused on one of the most alarming and heart-rending crises of our times. He bears witness to the war against Christianity, which is being waged with horrific brutality by an evil opponent. Everyone should read this and demand their government stand up against barbarism. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the political issues, and I might mention one of the people that we've had on the program with some regularity is Representative Frank Wolf, and he says that Johnnie Moore has been consistently sounding the alarm and seeking to awaken the church in the West to the existential threat that ISIS poses to Christians in the Middle East and beyond. His timely book underscores the urgency of confronting this evil. So I will give credit where credit is due. There have been some that have been speaking to this issue, but it is a real puzzle to me, Johnny, that if Jews are being attacked in anywhere in the world, the Jewish community rises up. If somebody attacks Muslims, CARE is immediately speaking to that issue. And yet we've had essentially a Christian Holocaust going on now for decades, and the Church of Jesus Christ oftentimes is not speaking to those issues.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, I live in Los Angeles now, and there's a sizable Jewish population in Southern California and especially in Beverly Hills. And I'll tell you, what I've heard a number of times from Jewish leaders, not just in California, but across the United States of America and around the world, is a criticism of Christians. And the criticism is exactly what you said moments ago. They say things like, what is wrong with you people? If these were members of our community, I mean, we'd be raising billions of dollars to provide for them. We'd be sending airplanes, to rescue them, bring them to Israel. Like, we would be doing what needed to be done, and we just don't understand. There are 2 billion of you Christians on planet Earth. Like, what's your problem? Why can't you take care of a few 100,000 refugees that are left over? I mean, this is 2,000 years of your faith. And you know what? I take it. It's an apt criticism. We have not responded in the way we could have responded. And now we have brothers and sisters in Christ who have survived ISIS in some of their cities only to die of a lack of food or shelter. So they're not going to be beheaded now because they got out of their city, the fortunate ones, but they could die because we're not doing what the Church of Antioch did for the Church of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago when Jerusalem was having a famine. A very, very simple thing. Provide for our brothers and sisters, and we're just not doing it. Much less speaking up for those that are still within ISIS's potential sway of influence. I mean, the fact is, we're witnessing a once-in-a-thousand-year crisis in that part of the world, and it is targeting Christian communities that survived Genghis Khan, but they might not survive this terror in the 21st century.
We'll continue our conversation with Johnnie Moore about defying ISIS right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
The American family is in decline, but sometimes it's hard to see how far we've come because the changes are often subtle and incremental. Each generation comes into the world already taking as a baseline changes that occurred before they arrived. Perhaps the best way to document the decline of the family is to compare where we are today to where we were in 1960. Back then, more than 9 out of 10 U.S. households with children had both a father and a mother who were married. Married parents of children wasn't the majority, it was the overwhelming norm. Today, married couples can only be found in about 2/3 of U.S. households with kids. During the decades from 1960 to now, we have discovered through various research studies that children need both a father and a mother. Dr. Patrick Fagan, working first at the Heritage Foundation and now at the Family Research Council, has put together a massive database of studies done by hundreds of researchers on marriage. They conclude what the Bible has taught for millennia. Children need a father and a mother. Out-of-wedlock births is one of the reasons children are growing up without two parents. In a column on the Great Society programs, Pat Buchanan gives these sobering statistics. Half of all children born to women under 30 in America now are illegitimate. 3 in 10 white children are born out of wedlock, as are 53% of Hispanic babies and 73% of black babies. Divorce is another reason for family decline, and as I've discussed in previous commentaries, cohabitation increases the likelihood of future divorce. Here again, we can see a remarkable change in attitudes. Charles Murray, in his book, The State of White America, reminds us of a survey of women in the 1960s. It asked, in your opinion, do you think that it is right for a woman to have sexual relations before marriage with a man she knows she's going to marry? 86% of the women said no. It is easy to see that the American family is in decline. All we have to do is look back a few decades. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Johnnie Moore with us today as we talk about his book, Defying ISIS, and we'll break it down in different sections. First one, what ISIS is doing, then why ISIS matters to you, then what are we losing? You know, your first chapter talks about burn their churches and kill their pastors. Just sobering things that we're hearing out of places like Damascus and so certainly out of all of Syria and Iraq. But again, you've had a chance to, with your film crew, hear the stories. And if we can, I know that we won't have time for all the stories. Can you share some of those? Because it is, I think, just chilling to realize what it is like to be a Christian in Syria, Iraq, or of course now even in what is kind of known as Kurdistan. There are certainly a very high price to pay if indeed you have Christian convictions, right?
Yeah. I mean, the fact is that there's not a single sizable church left in that part of the world which hasn't built a blast wall around its building, if the building still exists from the terrorism that's engulfing the region, because the general mentality is, you know, it's not a matter of if your church is going to be bombed, it's a matter of when your church is going to be bombed. And then when ISIS started making their march across Iraq and Syria, which has left them with one contiguous piece of land larger than the United Kingdom, which they mainly control, they started targeting Christian communities for ethnic cleansing. You know, so when they came into Mosul, you know, they marked the Christian houses with the Arabic letter N for Nazarene. They called all the men to a meeting to give them assigned housing, and they gave them three options. They said, you can convert, you can pay a tax, or we can kill you. That was their option. And then they proceeded to kill some, even disobeying their own rules. And then, you know, the rest of them fled in the middle of the night. And then their stories came with them. And so when I started documenting their stories, I mean, I found that every tent you went into had the worst story you've ever heard in your life. I mean, just horrific things. I remember, talking to one pastor who was describing the amount of women and children that had been killed or threatened or kidnapped by ISIS, and I couldn't keep track of all of them. He was just describing in just one kid after kid after kid, and woman after woman after woman, and it was totally awful to hear. One dad that we have on video describes the trauma of the experience, and as he's describing it, a Christian family, he's putting pictures on the floor of all the children that were killed or seriously injured. And again, I totally lost track of all of them. And then he describes a little kid that in the trauma of the experience goes over to a dead body and picks up bits of flesh and just carries them to the nearest adult he could find, and just this awful attempt by this child to just do something in the middle of this crazy situation. But the fact is that ISIS has done everything that you've seen, but in exaggerated form. The fact is, it's worse than we know that it is, and the world suddenly awakened to it with the beheading of all these Coptic Christians and the beheading and execution of the Ethiopian ones. But that was no surprise to the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria. They've been seeing this for a long time. I begin the book with an email that I received one night, and the email subject line was "awaiting death," and it was a pastor in Syria describing in live terms, sitting there typing as it happened, as mortars hit his house, and he's arguing with himself as to whether he should leave or just stay there and die in his bed. And then, the next chapter, a few pages later, chronicles the story of a pastor named Joseph, who went through his village from Christian family to Christian family to warn them that ISIS was coming, and eventually he knew that the families couldn't leave, and so he went to one family, a husband and a wife and their 2 kids, and he told them, he said, if ISIS comes, they're going to ask you if you believe in Jesus. And if you say you believe in Jesus, they're going to kill you. But it will only hurt for a second. And sure enough, ISIS came to that family, the 4 of them, and they came to the door, and they asked if they followed Jesus, and the family said yes, and it only hurt for a second, and they were all killed. And the children that were killed, in another village, someone sent me a text message that he had received in one evening from a Christian leader in the middle of Iraq as ISIS came into a village, and the Christian leader said that the militants had stopped asking the adults if they were Christians because they thought it would be more horrific if they asked the children, and so they did. They started asking the children, are you a Christian? Do you follow Jesus? And every single child they asked of those Christian families said that they were Christians and they would not deny Jesus Christ, and every single child was killed. And the stories go on and on and on. And then once all the Christians were gone from cities like Mosul, a city which had a population of Christians in the tens of thousands for centuries, but once they were all gone, then ISIS began to destroy their churches, to carve the crosses out of their tombstones, to break the crosses off the top of their buildings. They aimed not only to forcibly convert, kill, or traffic these Christians, but they aimed to wipe their history off the face of that Islamic state they're attempting to build.
Wow. Just incredible. One of the things that you point out in your book is that many of these individuals left with only a T-shirt on their back in the Iraqi summer, but they did so with the idea that they would probably eventually return to their home, because certainly the West, and under that I suspect they've probably thought the United States, but also other countries associated with, that would eliminate ISIS. Lo and behold, did they find out they had to endure a winter in Iraq in refugee camps with nothing more than what they took with them, basically what they were wearing during the summer. And I think it brings us to something else. We can certainly talk about the responsibility that the church has and has neglected of speaking out on this issue and supporting those who have been persecuted. But there is certainly a government element of that as well. You sort of sometimes want to ask, how bad does it have to get before the American people, but especially the United States government, says we need to do a little bit more than the little we've done to try to defeat ISIS, which, as you said, has a landmass that is one of the largest areas in the Middle East. And yet we seem to have done so little. And the Iraqi people, I think, were expecting that we would sometime or another step in and remove ISIS from that region, and that has simply not taken place.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is the United States has done too little, too late in every circumstance in this conflict. And yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. It was incomprehensible to the Iraqi people that the United States would allow Mosul, the second largest city in the country, to be taken over by these radical terrorists driving in pickup trucks. I mean, this isn't like a village that these people were able to sort of just overpower. I mean, this is the second largest city in Iraq, one of the largest cities in the Middle East. And I'm sure these people thought that they could go back and the United States would stop these people. But the fact is that we did too little, too late, and we're still doing too little, too late. I mean, just in February, ISIS went to 10 unarmed Christian villages along the Khabur River in Syria, and they kidnapped 300 Christians in one day from those 10 Christian villages along the Khabur River. And they did it in a convoy of 40 clearly marked ISIS vehicles going from village to village, kidnapping Christians. And that convoy wasn't hit by a single Western airstrike. There was no attempt to repel the convoy. It just went totally unabated into these Christian villages, kidnapped 300 people, and took them off to God knows where to do God knows what. And you wonder, if we really, really did believe in the threat that this type of ideology presents to the United States, why we wouldn't respond more forcefully. And the answer, by the way, if you sit down in Washington, D.C., and you talk to Republicans or Democrats about why we're not doing anything, they'll say, well, the American people don't have the will for us to do anything. They don't have the will for us to go back into Iraq and Syria. But the fact is that a CNN poll came out just last week, and it said the exact opposite. It said that the American people were more concerned about ISIS than they were about Russia or China, North Korea or Iran, and they were more concerned about ISIS in double digits. Now, so the United States government just isn't listening to the American people, and of course, no one wants a gigantic ground war or anything like that, like the previous situation in Iraq. But whether we like it or not, the United States is still the only superpower in the world. We're still the only nation with the economic resources and the military resources that we have. And so we have a certain obligation in this world to step into these vacuums of power, because if we don't do it, someone like ISIS, a bad actor, will do it. And chaos reaps chaos, and that destroys lives. And the fact is, as we have seen this week, as you saw so clearly just down the road from where you're talking to me now, if we don't deal with it there, we'll face it here.
We're going to talk about that because that's the second part of the book, Why ISIS Matters to You, and then also, of course, What We Are Losing. It's all part of the book, Defying ISIS. It is published by Thomas Nelson. We have information about it on our website. We'll continue our conversation with Johnnie Moore and then with you right after this.
Have you ever had this happen? You've been praying a long time for someone, and unexpectedly, someone comes up and says, "Hey, that person? I've been praying for them too." How does that make you feel? Encouraged? Motivated? Inspired? All of that and more? Praying is beyond value, but when you tell someone, it multiplies the joy. A while ago, Point of View began its Pray for America campaign, offering a free booklet, a wrist reminder, prayer updates, and you know what I think? I think many have prayed for the things we've asked them to pray for, but for whatever reason, you haven't officially joined the campaign. If that's you, I'm asking you to encourage Kirby and the team today and sign up before the National Day of Prayer this Thursday. pointofview.net/pray. Be an encouragement. Join us in prayer. Sign up for the Pray for America campaign. pointofview.net/pray. pointofview.net/pray. And make sure you join others Thursday and pray for America. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, our topic today is ISIS, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you have some comments about what we talked about what is happening in the Middle East, but also we're going to spend some time now talking about how ISIS is in your backyard. That's one of the titles of the chapter, and we don't have to look very far to find examples of that. Less than 15 miles where I'm sitting right now, 2 gunmen opened fire at an event that was sponsored by Pamela Geller's American Freedom Defense Initiative. It was a cartoon competition, if you will. It was the Muhammad Art Exhibit and Cartoon Contest, and they attacked that art exhibit. They were killed, but I think, again, you can say whether they were card-carrying members of ISIS or simply inspired by it, I think provides a great illustration of that. Johnny, let me come to you. Again, he's the author of the book, Johnnie Moore, Defying ISIS. We have a link to his website, which I think you will find very helpful as well. But these are some resources that I would certainly encourage you to get copies of. And as you saw what unfolded in Garland, Texas, and as you've documented in the book what has happened in other parts of the country, I think we have to recognize that this is not a problem that is simply located in the Middle East, right?
No, not at all. In fact, the FBI has outright said that they're tracking ISIS sympathizers in all 50 states in the United States. And the FBI earlier this year sent a notification to every single local police force in the United States of America out of a concern for an increasing amount of teenagers that plan on attempting to travel to Syria to fight with ISIS. And by the way, you know, the one of the jihadists that attempted to attack the event in Texas this week, I mean, he had basically told the world he was going to do it. I mean, all you have to do is look at his Twitter feed, and the guy basically said it was going to happen, and he was in direct communication with jihadists that were, you know, plotting similar attacks around the world, but are living and working, you know, in Syria. I mean, this is like absolutely incomprehensible. And by the way, it's even worse than that. You know, the University of Milan studied Arabic language tweets in the United States with the acronym ISIS in them, and 1 out of 5 of those tweets were sympathetic or in direct support of ISIS. I mean, this is like stranger than fiction. I mean, the fact is, this isn't just a threat over there; it's a threat right here. And we've also had incidences of terrorism. You know, we've had a beheading in Oklahoma City. We've had an attempted suicide bombing on the nation's capital, except the guy, you know, was involved in an FBI sting, and so he, you know, was caught. But he went with the undercover FBI agents to Home Depot to buy the shrapnel, and he went to a warehouse with the undercover agents to get his suicide vest, and that's when they arrested him. I mean, this is very, very, very serious. It's growing at a rampant rate, and I think we all ought to be, you know, sort of enraged that you know, we're not, as a country, focusing more on the intel and the research and the reaction required, you know, when these people are so just boldly talking about the types of things that they intend on doing on social media.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. What are your suggestions or thoughts about how to address the threat of really basically the radical ideas that are embodied in ISIS or the radical Muslim ideas? And in your book, I might just mention for just a minute that you talk about how the inspiration and instruction are readily available. But the second point I thought was really powerful. Individuals can now do what only nation states could previously do. You point out that the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor required 353 aircraft, 6 heavy aircraft carriers, 24 additional support and all the rest. By contrast, the 9/11 attacks were carried out by 19 militants and killed nearly 3,000 people. The point is now individuals with especially certain kinds of weapons, biohazard weapons, or even possibly nuclear weapons, or even just using aircraft and available smart bombs and things of that nature, can wreak a tremendous amount of havoc, which is why I think we need to be more vigilant than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, it only takes one ISIS sympathizer to take the Syrian and Iraqi jihad, the Islamic State jihad, to your local church or your community center. And that's a really scary thing to say, but it's the reality. I mean, we used to think that the only way terrorists would act is in these sort of grandiose forms, and that was the Al-Qaeda methodology. But ISIS is so bad, they've been excommunicated by Al-Qaeda, and in part, they've been excommunicated by Al-Qaeda because of their tactics. And they behave much, much more like guerrilla warriors than they do the sort of tactical, planned operations that we saw at the hands of Al-Qaeda. I mean, Al-Qaeda would plan for years and years and years with lots and lots of people and lots of resources to precisely execute a single attack that would kill a lot of people. But the ISIS methodology is much different. It's inspire one person to take a gun and to go to a place and just start killing people. And by the way, it used to be that if you wanted to be a terrorist, like these people, you had to go to some training camp in Afghanistan, and you had to live in rudimentary conditions, and you were surrounded by people that didn't speak your language, and how do you even get to Afghanistan in the first place? That wasn't easy to do. But it's a different time. Now you sit in front of your computer screen in suburban America or in Europe, and you listen to a person training you, not in a language you don't understand or that you had to learn first, but your first language. And they speak to you in your native tongue in the privacy of your own home, and you didn't have to travel to Afghanistan. The shocking thing about ISIS is this is an organization with people from 90 different countries, with educated people that grew up in Europe and the United States, with people that traveled on passports from our country and from European countries. This is a whole different ballgame. And just 10 years ago, all of us thought the worst thing we could imagine was Al-Qaeda. And now we're facing a terrorist group that is so brutal and so awful that they've been excommunicated by Al-Qaeda.
Wow. Let's take some phone calls because I think this will illustrate the point you were making just a minute ago about the recruiting aspect of that. So we'll head up to Michigan first. Bradley, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Johnnie Moore.
Yeah, I just want to state that I'm also a gamer as well as a truck driver. Whenever I get the free time to play online, I play with other people, and I've heard kids just talk about that they're going to be working. They want to be ICE. They want to do terrorist acts, and for me, I thought it was more of a just blow off. And these are like kids of 12 to 15 years of age, not like 17 on up to 19. And I'm like thinking this is just a blow off. They'll, after a few years, still kind of get a realization. But, after what I've been hearing over the radio about this, it's a serious threat, and then this shouldn't be taken lightly on any account.
Sure. When a kid says, I want to join ISIS, who knows whether that's the thrill of adventure or whether or not they'll actually do so. And what you've pointed out, Johnny, is they don't have to get on an airplane and fly to Afghanistan or Somalia now. Some of the homegrown sleeper cells are maybe happening in suburban bedrooms, don't you think?
And it's not maybe. It is happening. And by the way, ISIS is made of a lot of really, really young people. And not everybody travels over to Syria because they're sort of a raging theological jihadist. Some of them are, but a lot of them are just criminals. And the fact is, when somebody makes a terrorist threat, whether it's online or whether it's in person or however it happens, it's a crime in this country. You can't do that. It's illegal. And we as citizens, I think we have to start being more vigilant. When it comes to these things, because the fact is that we're learning that our government is doing everything they can. They're trying very, very hard in order to track all of this sort of digital information that's sitting out there, but they're not doing it enough and effectively, and they're not keeping up. And that's why all of us that live in this world of the internet need to pay very, very close attention. And by the way, as Christians, we can't deny the fact that ISIS has a particular interest in Christians. The front page of their magazine, Dabiq, in October was St. Peter's Square with an ISIS flag atop the obelisk in St. Peter's Square. They've targeted Christians in all these communities around the world. And so now it's time for us to pay very, very close attention and realize, it's not just something that's happening overseas. It's something that if our compassion doesn't compel us to speak up for those that are in harm's way, then at least our self-interest should.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Johnnie Moore and also take another phone call if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and talk about one of the chapters, How We Defeat ISIS, and that is at a number of different levels and with different kinds of strategies. But again, if you're interested in this, it's a 160-page book. Thomas Nelson, very well written, and it's a wake-up call for the West, and that is Defying ISIS. You can certainly go to the website by that same name that we have linked on our website. We'll come back and take some more phone calls and continue our conversation with Johnnie Moore right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Johnnie Moore as we talk about his book, Defying ISIS, Preserving Christianity in the Place of Its Birth and in Your Own Backyard. Talking at the moment about ISIS in your own backyard, and I wanted to get to Chapter 6, if I could, Johnnie, How We Defeat ISIS. And I recognize that not everybody can do a lot about helping Christians in the Middle East. We can certainly pray, and we have our Pray for America campaign, and we'll certainly transition that into praying for persecuted Christians. But there are still some things we can do to defeat ISIS. What would you recommend?
Well, I think as individuals, there are things that we can do. Most of us, listening into this conversation now, we're not members of government, right? So there are certain triggers we can't pull.
Sure.
But as individuals, there are lots of things that we can do. The first of which is educate ourselves. I mean, we have to know what's happening in the region. This is why I wrote the book, and we have to speak up about these issues. So we can't underestimate the crisis, and we also shouldn't oversimplify it. We need to know what's happening, and we need to talk about it. Number two, we need to give generously to those organizations that are on the front lines of the humanitarian crisis. Right now, we're witnessing the worst humanitarian disaster of our modern time. That's how the United Nations is characterizing the conflict between Iraq and Syria. And the fact is that we, I think, many times rely on organizations like the UN to take care of displaced people and such. But when I was in Iraq, I learned from the director of the UN in Iraq that if they operate at 100% efficiency, they can only care for 40% of the refugees in Iraqi Kurdistan. So if the private sector and the church and nonprofit communities don't step up, more people are going to die, and ISIS wins anyhow. And by the way, a lot of those that are going to die are brothers and sisters in Christ. Number three, it's time that we continue and we amplify the pressure on those and members of government that can do things. We need to make sure that they know that we're not only hoping that they're going to do more to combat this threat and to provide for those in harm's way, but that we expect them to do it. Just this week, by the way, at the end of last week, we were trying to get an Iraqi nun to come to the United States of America to testify in front of Congress. She was twice displaced by ISIS, and she's taking care of thousands of people in Iraqi Kurdistan, and she's doing it for Christians and for Muslims and other religious minorities, just taking care of everybody. But she arrived at the embassy, the consulate in Erbil in northern Iraq, and they denied her visa. Wow. Despite the fact that she had letters of invitation and endorsement from Democrats and Republicans, from 2 NGOs, and she had an invitation from Congress to speak to Congress. They denied her visa. And so what we immediately did is we activated Christians and politicians all across America to put unrelenting pressure on the State Department, and they were bombarded, and they were forced to respond, and we were pretty confident the nun's going to be able to come now. But see, the fact is that our political leaders only act when we make them act. It's just the reality of the situation. We need to put on lots of pressure. And then finally, this is the time to pray. And I don't mean like once in 52 weeks a year having a persecution Sunday or something. I mean, like this is the moment where we need to pray with the same intensity that we hope someone would pray for us. The Bible says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3, that we are to remember those who are in prison as if we were in prison ourselves. And that's what we need to do. We need to pray for these people. We need to give to these people. We need to speak up for these people the way we hope someone would do that for us. Paul told us what to pray. He wrote the church at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 3. He wrote, "Pray that we might be delivered from wicked and from evil people." And that's the prayer that we need to pray. We need to pray that these brothers and sisters in Christ and others who are in harm's way need to be freed from these wicked and evil people. And I think I'd just add one other point, and that is that now is the time, like never before, for Christians to love the Muslim communities in the United States of America. This is the time that every single Muslim community in every city in this country needs to know Christianity by our love. The fact is, it makes it much more difficult for a propagandist to deceive a young Muslim to join this jihad against these, quote, crusaders if they actually know Christians. And the fact is that terrorists aren't formed within communities of love. And I think it's a real shame that most Christians in this country don't know a single Muslim, and it makes it much easier for Christians to think all Muslims are jihadists and for Muslims to think that all Christians are crusaders. Now is the time for us in this moment in the 21st century that feels like a first century to be what the first century church was, which was A, willing to not only live for Jesus, but willing to die for Jesus, but B, we cared for not only for our own community, but for all communities. The Emperor Julian, who was a great enemy of Christianity in the Roman time, he wrote that the godless Galileans feed our poor and their own. That was the reputation of Christians in the first century, and it needs to be the reputation of Christians in the 21st century. We must not only be willing to live for Jesus, but like our brothers and sisters in Iraq and Syria, be willing to die for him. And they must know, the whole world, that we are Christians by our love.
Very well said. That quote you used was used in the first hour, so those came together very well. I might add one more element, and that is the book is very inexpensive. You can get it for paperback for just a little over $9. The Kindle is less than $2. So I would say, Johnny, that this would be something that churches might want to buy multiple copies of. Maybe you teach a small group study, and you would like to maybe have a couple weeks study to begin to pray for, but understand what is happening over in the Middle East and even what is a potential threat in our own backyard. So I would certainly recommend people have access to some of those resources. And one more I might mention, because as people click on your picture there, it will take them to defyingisis.com. Just before we run out of time, talk about some of the resources you have there at the website.
Yeah, it's a hub of the latest information on this crisis. And, in terms of educating yourselves, yeah, absolutely. The book is written as a primer to get you educated on the issue, and pastors all across the country are buying it for their congregations and for their leaders and giving it to them. But secondly, if you just follow people that are engaged on Twitter, I mean, this is a digital war as much as anything else. And a lot of people are using the hashtag Defying ISIS to raise their own voice in support for anything that is in opposition to the hatred that we're seeing emanating from the Islamic State. So we must educate ourselves and we must raise our voices, and defyingisis.com is a tool to help you do that.
Johnnie Moore, I appreciate you in so many different ways, but I especially appreciate you giving us an hour today on the program, and especially for writing this book and educating our listeners. We certainly appreciate the work that you've done there, and thank you for joining us on Point of View. Let's do it again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Going to take a break here, and as we wind down the program today, let me mention again, we've got a number of books and resources that we want to put in your hands, and we've mentioned in the past interviews we've done with Jay Sekulow on his book, Rise of ISIS, interview that we've done with Charles Dyer on the ISIS crisis. This one, a little different. Defying ISIS tells you the stories of what has happened in the Middle East, but also brings it right down to your backyard, and as a very important principle that you need to understand, because it affects not only what is happening to Christians across the country and across the world, but how it affects you right even in your home community. So we, again, encourage you to find out a little bit more about all of these issues, and you can do so by going to the website pointofview.net. All sorts of great resources there, so take the time to get my Viewpoints commentary, our Take Action section, our video, but also these two books would certainly be an encouragement to you and a great small group study that you might want to do as well. As you go there, don't forget we are dependent upon your financial gifts, and if you can help us out, we would appreciate that as well. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow on the National Day of Prayer.
Thanks to your brothers and sisters in Australia, people around the world are specifically praying for you right now. Did you know that? Lana Vosser said, "There is a fight for the destiny of the USA right now. The Lord is calling His people to arise and pray for the United States of America." Matt Prater, "We are calling the nations of the world to join in prayer and fasting with our brothers and sisters in Christ in the USA. We are believing for over 100 nations to join us in prayer and fasting for the U.S." And all of that is happening right now, today. Isn't that humbling and encouraging? The nations are praying for us. Thursday is our own National Day of Prayer, and we urge you to encourage us at Point of View by signing up for our Pray for America campaign. We will send you a free Pray for America booklet, a wrist reminder, and occasional email updates on important things to pray for. Step up, join today, pointofview.net/pray. Pointofview.net/pray. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.